The prophet preaches faithfully. The prophet is mocked and persecuted severely. The prophet tries to keep his peace, but the word is burning in his bones, and he has to let it out. And Paul spent some time teaching Titus to preach. Today on 3-in-1, as we consider Jeremiah chapters 19 through 21 and Titus chapter 2. I was listening to the radio on the way in today, and Alistair Begg was teaching on preaching from Nehemiah chapter 8. Man, everything that guy says sounds so clear and powerful and profound. It must be the accent. But he had a quote in there on preaching that I had to look up. So after some searching, I found it. Listen. There is no special honor in being so gifted, in being called to preach. There is only special pain. The pulpit calls them to it as the sea calls its sailors. And like the sea, it batters and bruises and does not rest. To preach, to really preach, is to die naked a little at a time, and to know each time you do it that you must do it again. Ha! Little did I know on the way in that our reading today would have so much to do with preaching, the terrifyingly wonderful calling given by God to the least of these. The prophet, the preacher, nothing special, nothing but a vessel, full of faith that God's special message can go forth from the mouth of a gloriously ordinary man, like a hammer that breaks rocks to pieces, like well-driven nails given by one shepherd. A message given by God to one man to then stand and deliver unaltered and full force to the congregation. I can't count the number of times after having had the message fully formed and even on paper before service, then I see someone come in who I know will be dramatically affected by the content of the message. And then I pray a prayer. I pray a prayer in this precarious position, and I say to the Lord, Lord, I am your under-shepherd. I am only your messenger. This is not my message. This is your message. So please help me not to overdo it, not to underdo it. Help me to deliver your message in your way. The reason why I pray that prayer is because I know how fragile of a creature I am. And because of the fear of man, there is a temptation to alter the message of God to make it more palatable or acceptable to the congregation. But I know that is unacceptable to God. So I've learned to reserve the holy right to disappoint and even anger men in order to please and remain faithful to God. Now, that does not mean that it's always easy. And I must confess, I've never gone through anything even remotely close as to what we read Jeremiah went through today, as he faithfully delivered God's message. They mocked him. They delivered him to the stocks. And since Jeremiah is human, he had a hard time with it all. It's not easy to die weekly, publicly, to let people see you consumed and poured out in preaching, and then more often than not receiving persecution from the very people that you preach to. So, in our reading today, Jeremiah let out a little lament to the Lord, saying, "O Lord, you deceived me when you promised me your help. I have to give them your messages because you're stronger than I am, but now I am the laughingstock of the city, mocked by all. You have never once let me speak a word of kindness to them. It's always disaster and horror and destruction. No wonder they scoff and mock and make my name a household joke. And yet I can't quit. For if I say I'll never mention the Lord, never more speak in his name, then his word in my heart is like a fire that burns in my bones, and I can't hold it in any longer. Yet on every side I hear their whispered threats, and I am afraid. We will report, they say. Even those who were my friends are watching me, waiting for a fatal slip. He will trap himself, they say, and then we will get our revenge on him. But the Lord stands beside me like a great warrior, and before him, the mighty, the terrible one, they shall stumble." I'll have to remember that last part the next time that I'm tempted to soften the message in order to avoid persecution. The Lord stands beside me, the mighty one, the terrible one, the Lord. Now, you must know that Jeremiah let out that lament from the stocks after they mocked him. So even though we are the Lord's messengers delivering the Lord's message, and even though he stands beside us and walks with us, that does not mean that we will avoid all persecution. And the preacher must acknowledge that. He must acknowledge that that's par for the course if he is to accept and diligently dispense the duties of his calling. And yet, young Jeremiah was still learning this. And so was Titus, who I think was a little bit older at the time of Paul writing his epistle. And I'm not sure if you noticed it today, but the primary content of Titus chapter 2 was Paul teaching Titus how to preach, knowing that preaching, really solid preaching, starts with and includes the whole life and walk of the preacher. Paul said in verse 1, "As for you, Titus, promote the kind of living that reflects wholesome teaching." That's good, isn't it? Listen to it again in the Phillips translation. "Now, you must tell them the sort of character which should spring from sound teaching." And then in verse 7, Paul says, "And you yourself must be an example to them by doing good works of every kind. Let everything you do reflect the integrity and seriousness of your teaching." There's that word reflect again. Titus, let your walk reflect your word. In everything, set them an example by doing what is good. In your teaching, show integrity, seriousness, and soundness of speech that cannot be condemned, so that those who oppose you may be ashamed because they have nothing bad to say. Oh, they will still say what they may, but it will not be because of some slip-up on your part. See, it's part of the preacher's responsibility to pray and put in order each and every word. Again, what a terrifyingly wonderful responsibility. Solomon described it this way at the end of Ecclesiastes. "The preacher pondered and sought out and set in order many proverbs. The preacher sought to find acceptable words, and what was written was upright, words of truth." The words of those who are wise move people to take action. Their collected sayings are like well-driven nails given by one shepherd. And guys, that's my desire, that every word would be his, that my every day would be walking in his will, that the pulpit ministry would be truly life-altering and life-giving, even if that means it has to be a life-giving rebuke. And that's exactly how Paul ended his exhortation to Titus, to teach Titus the terrifyingly wonderful calling to preach and teach. He says at the end of chapter 2, "These are the things you should teach. Encourage people and give them hope. Correct them with full authority. Don't let anyone look down on you." And we've learned the only way to stop people from looking down on you is to give them someone to look up to. So, preacher, teacher, man of God, woman of God, let your word be God's word, and let your walk reflect your word.